Welcome today to the Noisy Reality episode that will be dealing with Professor Char Miller's new book, Burn Scars, which is a documentary history of fire suppression from colonial origins to the resurgence of cultural burning. Uh, Professor Miller is at Pomona College in California, and he is a prolific scholar on the whole issue of American environmental history. Um, and I have great respect for scholars as prodigious as Professor Miller, or Char. We will be calling him by his first name today. So these are some of the books he's done. Some of them have to do with when he was teaching in San Antonio in Texas. So as you can see, we're dealing with a book that dealt with a flood in San Antonio in 1921. We have a book about Theodore Roosevelt, always an interesting figure to talk about in this context. A history of San Antonio, Oglala, Waterford Dry Land, 𝗕cie𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗂𝗁, he can explain what that is. The nature of hope, grassroots organizing, environmental justice. A book relevant for our talk today, Not So Golden State, Sustainability versus the California Dream. And one of my favorite titles here, Where There's Smoke, about the politics of marijuana. Always a fun topic to talk about. And here we have the book on public lands, On the Edge, water immigration, the politics of the Southwest. I've driven through Death Valley, so it's sort of interesting. I'd like to see a history of Death Valley. And here, I guess you did a book that was a collection of photos and everything of the great national wilderness we have in this country. His latest book, which we'll get into in detail because it will interrelate with what we're talking about, is a discussion about the use of fire and wild lands in America historically. This book primarily focuses in on the West Coast, but of course we can generalize and talk about it throughout the country. Now, before I start, I wanted to just pose some questions for Char about this. And first of all, we have the specifics of the situation that exists with this fire that we're seeing in Los Angeles. And it is being called a perfect storm. We see here Douglas Kelly, the UK Center for Ecology and Hydrology, calls this the perfect storm. That you have this combination of high temperatures, low humidity, dry vegetation, and the offshore Santa Ana winds coming down, or offshore is not, I guess when you deal with the Diablo winds further in Northern California and Santa Ana winds, you have this combination. And what's interesting is that the National Weather Service says this is the first time in history that this criteria has been met anywhere in the United States during the month of January. Now, the other issue is the question of the drought in California. Now, I've lived in California. I have not lived in California permanently, but my family moved out there many years ago, and I never in Northern California experienced any kind of situation where it didn't rain. So this, of course, is quite extraordinary that you have these abnormally dry conditions that have been going on for quite a long time, with 0.16 inches of rain coming in, and abnormally dry. And the other issue that is to be discussed quickly or in depth is the fact of climate change. Now, one of the things that's coming out with the way the media is talking about this is there's this critique about they're focusing in, and we'll of course have time to talk about the question of response, but the question of climate change, of course, is a wider issue, one that enhances all this and embraces this entire picture. And some of the issues coming up by the scholars of climate change is this whole issue of hydroclimate whiplash, that you'll have extremely rapid swings between intensely wet and dangerously dry weather that is increasing worldwide. And the studies, these are based on scientific studies, that this is happening all throughout the world, in every part of the world that from in the past 10 years. And the other issue is this question of wilderness-urban interface. But I wanted to just throw those out because we're going to go into depth with Professor Miller on his book. But thank you so much, Char, for joining us today. And I was wondering if you could just respond to some of these broader questions. And for those of you in waiting, just put up your hand at some point. Let Char do his thing for a while, and then we'll start to bring in your comments and questions and commentary. So, Char, please take it away.
Great. Well, thank you so much to everyone who is on here, to Jim for setting this up and for the chance to talk about burn scars, but a good deal more than that. Let me start with sort of two sets of data, some of which is hinted at in the PowerPoint that Jim has been showing us and the data that is represented in it. The first is the long-term process, and then the second is the short-term data of this moment now. The long-term data suggests the degree to which climate disruption has been with us for nearly 40 years. And it's reflected in the larger data set that the Environmental Protection Administration has assembled, suggesting that what we call the U.S. Southwest, basically El Paso west to Los Angeles, and then north up into Colorado and Utah, New Mexico, and Arizona, and obviously California as well. What it shows is that this region has been drying out since the mid-1980s, so there's the 40-year process. The second piece of EPA data is that they've projected into the present century, the next 70 so years. They seem to have data that they feel comfortable publishing, that this is going to continue for this particular region. In short, California has always been a state of drought, not in drought. If you say you're in drought, that means it's episodic. If you say you're a state of drought, that means that's the norm. Drought is the norm. Rain is the abnormal part of this cycle that we go through. Yes, there have been wet years. The last couple of years have been wetter than we have been having, but that's a kind of aberration in this longer stretch of data that the EPA has done. And let me just give you a sidebar on that. All this data disappeared in 2017 when the first Trump administration came into office. I suspect it's going to disappear tomorrow. So go look for it now, grab it, screen grab it as I did in 2017. But the data is there and the scientists have this data. So hold that data for a second, that we're in a drought that's running up through the end of this century. One of my great regrets is that I will be dead by the end of this century. I really want to see what 2090 looks like. That's not going to happen unless I'm mosaic-like in terms of my lifespan, which I don't anticipate. The other piece of how to think about this climate disruption is also to go back over only the last 7 or so years, between 2017 and 2024. As you know, if you've been paying attention to the data on the planetary heat index, every single one of those years, at some point or another, when it jumped onto the record year, as it either continuing the warm cycle or besting the year before. As 24 was the warmest year on record, so was 22. Their ranks have been shifting because of, unfortunately, increased heat. But that increased heat is directly tied to the process of drought in the American Southwest. The final data I want to do with this climate disruption looks at that same period of time between 2017 and 2024, not including the fires in this January. So hold on those because we'll get to them. Of the 20 largest by acre fires in the state of California between 2017 and 2024, 13 of the 20 have occurred since 2017. Many of them have occurred in Southern California, the Thomas Fire, the Woolsey Fire, and a bunch of others. If you go back to 2003, 19 of the largest 20 by acreage have burned in that period between 2003 to the present day. That's an extraordinary set of data that dovetails beautifully what EPA is linking it to in terms of drought and the like. In short, this region has been drying out. It will continue to dry out. And we will continue to have mega fires of one form or another, whether they're urban as these were, or rural as the fire that wiped out Paradise, the Camp Fire in 2018, doesn't, or all of the complex fires in 2020 and 2021. Another way to think about this, in August and September of 2020, which was a horrible fire season across the West, at that point, four of the five largest fires in California history were burning simultaneously, which is why photographs on Instagram and Facebook of sort of orange, god awful orange skies from Southern California north into Oregon and Washington were daily grist for any journalist's mill. So we've got some real serious problems here that are long term and that have short-term, massive short-term consequences, as we saw in early January when the Paradise and Eaton fires erupted.
Thank you. Now, I wanted to ask you, let's get into your book.
Sure.
Let's talk about the first part of your book deals with Spanish colonization of California. What are they encountering in terms of the indigenous people using fire? And you have a whole montage of commentary. What does that say? What does that tell us? And also, as I mentioned earlier, how does that relate to other parts of the United States in terms of contact with the native peoples in this continent?
Well, thank you so much for that, because the opening of the book is quite deliberate in sort of a structural way. I began working on the book in the autumn of 2020, in the midst of the pandemic. My students were gone. I was worried about them. The sky is blowing up in fire. I was worried about surviving. And I thought, well, I'm an historian. Why don't I think about this issue? And so started digging in the record, the historical record, for trying to think about these big fires at that moment, but fires that had a longer history. And I started digging around in the Spanish colonial records, in diaries and correspondence, to see what I could find about the impact of these invading Spanish missionaries and the militia and the cities that they were starting to build in Southern California, the villages, the presidios. And lo and behold, all of a sudden you start seeing they're recording fire. They're seeing it everywhere. In fact, one of them says, as they're anchored off of, or maybe even sailing into the San Diego Bay, he named it the Bay of Smoke. And why was that? Because the Kumeyaay people who are with us still, who still practice fire management on their very small campos, there's very small, what we might call reservations, were burning nonstop. Every indigenous polity in northern, southern, and central California were using fire to manage their landscape. The estimate now from fire ecologists is that in the 18th century, upwards of 4 to 10%, depending on the ecology, was being burned annually. We come nowhere near that in terms of the amount of acreage that gets burned. But we also have a lot more people, 36, 38 million people in this state. So, maybe burning that much is not a good idea. But the record shows two things, one of which is they constantly were recording fire. And because the Spanish had used fire for a long time in the Iberian Peninsula to manage their grasslands, they understood what fire looked like in a burned and scorched landscape. And now all of these diaries and letters and the like, the montage that Jim described, also points to something else. It's not that they don't like fire. They just don't like fire in the hands of the indigenous peoples. Why? Because they recognize that if they enabled and continued to allow the indigenous communities that they encountered and which they wished to convert to Catholicism and to a Spanish agriculture, sedentary agriculture, they had to get rid of fire because the indigenous people could survive on their own. They didn't need the Spanish. As one of the Spanish missionaries said, and this is a translation, but the word works. We need to denaturalize indigenous people. We have to uproot them literally from the cultural landscapes that they had created, in which they were burning for material goods, they were burning for food, they were burning for ritual objects, they were creating an entire indigenous landscape that served their needs. And the Spanish went, but that doesn't serve ours. So they actually prohibited fire and tried to snuff it out. The first sort of suppression of fire in California came at the hands of missionaries for whom this was a political, social, cultural, and environmental impact, a law that was designed to shape the land, reshape the land in the image that the Spanish wanted, which is not burning to produce food, but in fact growing food with a plow. And that's the conversion process that they saw, which is denaturalize those people so that they will become like us.
And the next part of your book deals with the issue of what happens after the Mexican War.
Yes.
When the California is incorporated into the United States as a result of the conquest. So explain, and you use that term settler colonial very explicitly.
Yeah.
So explain what you mean and how that argument evolves.
So the language of settler colonialism applies brilliantly to the Spanish because they didn't just want to settle a place. They wanted to colonize it intellectually, culturally, environmentally, in every way, as I've just sort of shown. The Americans also felt that way. Once they sort of blew into California in the 1840s and not only just pushed the Mexican state out, but also began to do the exact same thing that the Spanish missionaries had done, which is, if we're going to convert this land in the ways that we want, whether it is logging, mining, grazing, or producing agriculture, we have to control fire, we have to control its incidence, and we have to control people who would like to burn. The complication here was, and what would emerge as the U.S. Forest Service in 1905 as an example of this complication, was that there were miners, white miners, or whatever their ethnicity, who wanted to burn to clear away rock faces so that they could get after the ore that was there. There were ranchers who understood, as did the Spanish ranchers, that fire could regenerate grasslands to their interests. And there were also white loggers who understood that if you used what we now call prescribed burns or controlled burns, what indigenous people still today call good fire, you could actually use this good fire to regenerate certain species that you wanted to log. So what emerged is that there is a contested moment in the late 19th, early 20th century as fire agencies emerge at the state of California level and in the federal level in the guise of the Bureau of Forestry, which would ultimately evolve into the Forest Service, that they not only had to come up with the language of suppression or reinvent it because the Spanish had already done so, but they have to suppress their own people who understood the role that fire could play in allowing different kinds of economies, ranching, farming, mining, and logging, to emerge full-born. So it's a really interesting dynamic moment that emerged between two forms of settler colonialists, those who want fire and those who wish to suppress it. In the end, the Forest Service will become the agency that makes the claim ultimately stick that fire suppression is critically important to the production of a new kind of capital economy, capital-driven economy, that requires the suppression of fire. Their perspective is essential, though. You got to keep it in mind. This is a more nuanced argument. From their vantage point, if the goal is to get wood fiber into the market, logs, the last thing you want is standing trees burning, right? For them, that sort of undercuts their economic activity. But it also meant that other people who had a different idea about how to get logs into the marketplace, and the book has many stories of people who wrote about this in various journals all over the United States. Their vantage point was not taken seriously, and even worse, they were tagged with the racist language of they practiced Paiute forestry. That is to say, probably, as I say in my introduction, the worst thing one white person could call another white person in the late 19th, early 20th century was an Indian. Or at least that's how I interpret that language, as being pegged to those who disagreed with what the Forest Service had to say. And frankly, the Forest Service, in a couple of different directions, cooked their books. They had researchers who were looking at the question of prescribed burns. And at least in one case, they put logs up against trees and then did a prescribed burn. And what a shock. Those trees burned, and they say, therefore, you can't use this prescribed burning and control burning because it actually doesn't work. Other people demonstrated that it did work, but that was enough evidence for the Forest Service to make the claim and then go public with it in a massive media campaign centered around California that made the case that any fire was bad fire, any fire must be suppressed, and it must be suppressed anywhere at any time.
Right. And of course, that's the Smokey the Bear campaign, which I remember actually as a kid in Georgia. I put on a Smokey the Bear hat. Now, one thing that's interesting about that part of the book is you talk about, and you have these documents getting into this issue, that fire had to be suppressed, fire had to be fought. And this attitude essentially, and then you mentioned this, how in the South it was different. Now, why was it different in the southern part of the United States?
Yeah, so this is very interesting. So I've just sort of made a notion that there is this monolithic argument that the Forest Service won. It did by and large, except in the South. Indigenous people, by the way, continued to burn regardless of what the Forest Service said. And there's a whole section that we can get into in a little bit. But hold on to that argument. In the South, with white settlers, they had enough experience with longleaf pine to know that keystone species required fire to burn and regenerate itself. If you took fire out of longleaf pine ecosystems, it would convert to other tree species ultimately, because fire would choke out those trees and other things would pop up. So was interesting to me is how early that opposition emerged. It emerged in the 1880s, before even the suppressive language really fully took hold. And one of the key figures was a woman, Ellen Call, who went to the first Forest Congress in U.S. history, basically called out foresters for not understanding the ecosystemic need for fire in longleaf pine. Her words would then echo across the rest of that century and well into the 20th century, such that even though the Forest Service tried to snuff out fire in the South, its own forest researchers knew better. But they suppressed what they knew their arguments could be because the agency would not allow it. But that didn't stop others from making this case. In fact, one of the key figures in this, a guy by the name of H.H. Chapman, who was a professor at the Yale School of Forestry, founded in 1900, so it's 125 years old today. And it's now called the Yale School of the Environment, really a keystone institution. Chapman, like Call, and Chapman is doing this in 1910, 1912, just as the agency is putting out its language on suppression. He went, oh no. He actually did the scientific studies that could counter the agency's presumption, its political presumption, its ideological presumption. And he's at a school that Gifford Pinchot, the first head of the Forest Service, underwrote. So Yale becomes the center of both the language of suppression and also its counter narrative. And Chapman, when he became head of the Society of American Foresters, when he was the president of that organization in the 1930s, created a panel at one of the annual sessions, invited all of these non-Forest Service fire managers to speak at SAF. They were all a little worried. And yet the panel was productive because what it did was to challenge the long-standing argument, now 40 years old, that fire must be suppressed. And all of a sudden, this little kindling, this little moment emerged. And that would ultimately spill over even into California, which was the epicenter of anti-fire in the United States, when various Forest Service researchers would transfer from Georgia and Florida and start to work for the state agency and/or for the University of California, which was a hotbed of they hated fire. And all of a sudden they start hiring people that liked fire. This became a very complicated story, but it suggests that the counter narrative, which seemed to have been suppressed itself, never died. And that's a really interesting story to keep in mind as we head into the inauguration. The counter narratives need to be given kindling of their own to sort of work our way through into a different place and a different time.
Well, you talk about kindling, of course. The Yale school up there is absolutely extraordinary.
Mm-hmm.
They do at that particular institution.
Yeah.
Really great resource. Now, one thing that's interesting is that how do we relate the latter part of the book, where you talk about how people have changed their opinion about this, to wider political movements in the past 50 years? Because the latter part of your book basically talks about there's a law in California, the Senate law, I believe you talked about in
Yep.
2021 passed, that legitimates the use of prescribed burning culturally
Yes.
by indigenous people. Well, that,
Yeah.
of course, we have this wider context of environmentalism popping up. Rachel Carlson writing her book on this, I forget the title.
Island Spring.
Silent Spring, yes.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and then all these different trends happening throughout the 60s, the environmental movement, Native American resuscitation of and valorization of their history, etc. How does this all blend together to create this moment we're in now, where we're now there? And again, we're seeing this terrible event occur, but how does this all interrelate to your arguments toward the end of the book?
So one of the ways I think it relates is to think about the long history, now 70 years old, when Rachel Carson and others start to help white society, by and large, certainly the dominant culture, to understand our place within natural landscapes of one form or another, and begin to take them seriously as both a place to live better and more lightly on the land, but also to recognize that the Industrial Revolution, against which Roosevelt and Pinchot and others were trying to create these sort of hurdles to slow that thing down, was now manifest in DDT and all these other toxins that were invading our bodies, let alone every river source, every groundwater source. I mean, we've learned a lot since Silent Spring, and Silent Spring itself has become a kind of broader way by which to think about ourselves in this place. And so part of what Burn Scars is trying to do is to use fire as another way to get at these issues. And it struck me as I was reading the Spanish colonial records that the key to this book would be not only developing that argument across time, that is to say, indigeneity and the use of indigenous fires, good fires, was a critical version of how to explain early Californian history, but it's no less a critical way by which to understand 2022, 24, and now 25. So part of what I did with the book structurally was to not only start with the colonial version as a way to locate in time indigenous fire practices, but also to open it up with a beautiful essay that I commissioned from Michael Connolly Misquish, a fire manager, elder, and executive director of the Kumeyaay people in what's now San Diego County. Brilliant guy, wonderful speaker. He and I have been on panels together. And I asked him, give me that history in about 4,000 words or so, which he did. And I centered it as the lead essay as a way to both get that story in there, and secondly, as a bookend for where the book closes, which, as you mentioned, Jim, includes not only Senate bills and legislative action on the part of Congressional Rep Jared Huffman, who has probably the most beautiful district in Congress, running up from Marin all the way up the coast to the border with Oregon. But Huffman has introduced legislation that actually took federal land and returned it to Northern California tribes. The state has now, as you said, Jim, legitimized the use of cultural fire and made it not liable. If it escapes, you can't sue, which is a really critical part of this process. And then I have a series of contemporary indigenous fire managers, Bill Tripp, and others who have written beautifully in the aftershock of 2020, 2021 about the need for and the return of good fire, indigenous fire, as a mechanism by which to solve some of the dangers imposed on this very drought-driven, climate-discorded landscape that wants to burn and will burn. But let me close on this part and then we can circle back. The 𝗕𝘂𝗿𝗹𝗶 people on whose land I sit in Southern California, like the 𝗔𝗵𝗍, like the 𝗏𝗏𝗔𝗵 and others who managed this landscape, Southern California, with fire for millennia, a few years ago was given by a philanthropist an acre of land bordering Altadena and Pasadena. That land, which they started to manage, started to clear, started to put a little fire on the ground. It was just reported today from satellites, so they have not been able to get back because nobody can get back in the northern part of that fire zone yet. That they think some of their interventions in terms of building defensible space and clearing away debris and all of this other stuff, including apparently huge piles of logs for firewood, may have helped save a portion, if not the whole, of the landscape in a sense. We'll see what actually has happened once they can get back onto the land. But here's a small example, 1 acre. It doesn't have global significance, but it fits the pattern that the Klamath people, the 𝗏𝗶, and others have been arguing, the North Fork, Mono up in the Central Sierra, who have been putting fire on the ground in support of other agencies' actions and in support of their own interests, cleaner watersheds and the like. That here's a practice that is millennially driven and tested that we need to reconsider at an agency level, at a social level, and at the ground level.
Well, thank you. Now we're talking to Professor Char Miller, who is the author of a new book called Burn Scars, published by Oregon State University Press. And for those of you who are here, please raise your hands and we'll start to include everybody in the conversation. Now, one thing that I could see you doing is a compilation of commentary and opinion about what just has happened in Los Angeles. And,
oh, yes.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And
yeah.
And one thing that I'm sort of curious your thoughts are of the recovery process. You're going to have this huge debate about zoning, about how to build, about, I looked at the battles over the budget in Los Angeles about the fire department. Right. Are they going to accept a fire department budget of $1.5 billion? Are they going to accept a design that would be, how do you rebuild and protect against this kind of situation from happening again? But let me ask others to, join in. Just raise your hands and let me include you because you those of you who know me well, I could keep going on for hours, but I don't want you to do. I want you to come in and talk too. Yes, Alex, go on, Alex. Unmute.
Yeah. Thanks, Professor or Char. Yeah, so I want to ask about um, what's the role of big agriculture and their water use and kind of this overall system. A bunch of, I don't know if you've heard, but a bunch of people have drawn attention particularly to the couple, the Resnicks,
Uh-huh.
their use of, water for almonds and pistachios that, uses a huge amount of water. But, and, as like an overall issue in terms of, water use. And, but I guess the other question would be this just the overall depletion of water over time. An argument that like, oh, they're going to eventually, draw down the whole Colorado River. And essentially, I don't know, some people already by, I don't know, 2080 or something like that. Essentially, Los Angeles will cease to exist or, those kind of scenarios.
Sure.
Especially under extreme climate change,
Yeah.
7 degrees.
Yeah. Yeah. So that you've got a lot of material going on in there. Let me squash one conspiracy theory. The Resnicks have nothing to do with water in Los Angeles. They own enormous amounts of water in the Central Valley. And they live in Beverly Hills, but that's where the story ends. I mean, there was this rumor that they, owned LA reservoirs, which they do not. They own public water in Los Angeles. That is to say, my water comes from a organization called the Golden State Water Company, which is a private distributor of water that is owned by various other companies that the Resnicks own completely. But that has nothing to do with firefighting. The other question, though, is that if you go back to where I began with this drying out of the U.S. Southwest, it begs multiple questions because much of this data, if you think about the Colorado River, which supplies potable water for 40 million people. Let me give you that number again. 40 million people draw off of the Colorado River. The Rio Grande, which also comes off of the Rocky Mountains, it feeds into Albuquerque, feeds into El Paso, and runs along the U.S.-Mexico border, as you know. So Ciudad Juarez and El Paso, I don't know what that's, 5 million people plus draw their water from the same river. All sorts of interesting international complications ensue. But if we're not going to get the amount of precipitation, and particularly snow, and why snow? Because snow sits on the ground and then slowly with spring warms and trickles down. If it comes in the version of rain, it hits the ground and moves. So it's a very different system in terms of how you capture it, if you can capture it, and then utilize for ag, and most especially for the urban populations like Tucson and Phoenix, which draw their water increasingly from the Colorado River, as well as Los Angeles, as well as San Diego, as well as Las Vegas. I mean, all of a sudden you can see not only the 40 million people who draw on this thing, but the complications that come from that. And one of the complications is that if you are seeing climate disrupted rainfall processes, you also get big fires, and not just in California. And it's from Forest Service researchers themselves that I've, drawn off of their research, particularly in the northern parts of New Mexico and Arizona, which have had massive fires, huge fires, close to 1 million acre fires. They get much less reported than the small 40,000 amount we get here in Los Angeles, because there's a difference between LA and northern New Mexico in terms of media saturation. What they discovered, and it's not surprising, is that these big fires from the 2010s right through the 2020s have so cooked the soil that pinyon pine no longer can regenerate because the biochemistry of the soil does not accept the seeds that pinyon pine drop to regenerate. So what's going to happen? Well, what is already starting to happen is the conversion of that landscape. often initially as grass, but then in time, some kind of shrub or, I mean, we got a climax thing that we will have to see unfold. But it means that the pinyon pine, which is one of the beautiful species of northern New Mexico, may no longer hold true. Go to the Mojave. Its key species, the Joshua tree, has been hit with two massive fires in which upwards of 2 million Joshua trees. And you look at a desert and you go, that can't burn. Well, yes, it can. And the problem for Joshua trees isn't the soil composition, is they can't regenerate once burned. This is not like longleaf pine. So we got a Joshua Tree National Park, which by the end of this century may have no Joshua trees. No less true in Sequoia National Park, where we don't think those trees are going to survive past this century. So get there while you can, people. In the same way at Glacier National Park. It's not going to have glaciers. It will be a misnomer or a reminder of what we didn't do, which is to somehow mitigate our behavior such that we can ratchet down the temperature of this planet, which every year seems to be the hottest year on record. So it isn't just LA that's a problem here. It is, in fact, the way in which this planet, the human species on this planet, has come to love its own life, driven by fossil fuels, petrochemicals, all of the energy that we can produce in any fashion whatsoever, since electric cars tend to get their electricity from various fossil fuel central power plants. Moving to hydro is a great thing, but what if the Colorado River does something that we don't want to have happen, which is to run out of water, or, which may also happen at the same time, all of that silt backing up behind Hoover Dam will ultimately make it one of the great waterfalls on the planet. But that also means that dam is out of commission. So we've got a lot of things we've got to worry about. And, you know, in an absurd and disturbing way, for those of us who are environmental historians, this is like nirvana. There's a challenge and a problem almost every minute that requires an historian to sort of think about what the implications are in the past and how we got to where we are, which is what Burn Scars tried to do.
Well, talking about nirvana, we know that a lot of Americans on January 20th are going to be very happy with who's coming into the White House.
Yeah.
It's their nirvana. And Mr. Trump has actually said in the past, when there was these disasters, well, how many of these people actually support me? He did this little calculus of whether I'm going to send them aid or not. And you've had Governor Newsom promise a Marshall Plan. You had President Biden promise 180 days, I will take care of everything. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are from a historian's point of view about the issue of recovery.
Yeah, recovery is going to be tough. Here and elsewhere that have had these enormous burns, in part because there's that political calculus. The Speaker of the House very recently said, yes, we'll give them the money, but only if we can get debt ceiling ratcheted down. Okay. So hold us up for hostage and in a way that is politically driven. The president in himself, we don't need to watch him on January 21. We already know what he's going to do because he did it in January 2017. Executive orders like crazy are going to fly around and he'll tell us that this matters, but executive orders don't carry budgets. Keep that in mind. He can do a lot of stuff with an executive order, but he has to pay for it. And where's he going to get the money? This is why every seat in Congress matters enormously. Every special election that comes up over the next 4 years, you have to contest, because we clawed it back between 2017 and 2020, and we have to do that same thing. The dilemma is the damage that will be done between now and then could be robust in exactly the agencies, the Park Service, the Forest Service, BLM, the Bureau of Land Management, Fish and Wildlife. They're going to go after those agencies' budgets that for the past 4 years have been trying to do a lot of really good work. Maybe not as fast as they could have done. It's hard to know how to judge that. But I think one of the sort of politicizing moments is tomorrow. And to give up, to cede to this guy and those MAGA megaphones, the discourse in the United States, I would take you back to 1910, 1920. There was opposition to the language of suppression that ultimately proved successful. The Forest Service no longer argues that it's only suppression. It's got to figure out the biochemical value of fire. It's hard sell. People don't like it, especially when their houses burn. But in fact, fire is as destructive as it is regenerative, creative, and valuable. And that's what the message is, I think, from the book. And it's a way for us to also think about politics. Fight, 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 because otherwise we don't get the message out. And the message needs to be there to combat that which this new administration is going to advocate.
Thank you. Now, again, those who want to have comments, questions, please raise your hand. I want to ask you, though, if you could clarify this whole issue of the smelt fish.
Sure.
What's your take on that? And I'll go to Aaron in a minute after that. But
yeah. So we're now talking about water in the Central Valley of California and whether the smelt and tiny little fish, which the GOP absolutely hates because it's tiny, it has no value to anybody except to the smelt itself. And this has happened all over the country where, because of the way the Endangered Species Act was written, you have to focus in on a species that's threatened or endangered. And that becomes the hook by which you then can utilize federal government's power to protect that particular species and, by extension, the ecosystem in which it lives. 50 years later, I would have loved to have sort of rewritten that legislation to expand biodiversity and issues like that as a mechanism by which to do this, but this is where the law is. So environmental organizations have used it from one space to another. The red-cockaded woodpecker in longleaf pine ecosystem becomes a way to protect that ecosystem. But in this case, the Delta smelt becomes the tool here. But it's a stand-in for a lot of other issues, including indigeneity and indigenous sovereignty. It is a stand-in for commercial fisher folk who understand the smelt's the need for the smelt, and thus for salmon and other fish that they want to fish, whose interests they want to protect so that they can continue to do this. It's a stand-in for environmental organizations, urban and rural, to try to regenerate, recover landscapes that have been badly bulldozed, cut over, burned over, grazed almost to extinction. And what the fish, the smelt, or name your endangered species does is to build human coalitions that vary across time and place, as they should, to use that animal, to use that flower, to use that tree, to wrap ourselves around that thing. It's really interesting that we think of it as a way to protect them, and I think of it as a way that they protect us. There's a kangaroo rat in Southern California. It's not a kangaroo and it's not a rat, so it's a misnomer, but it lives in the alluvial fans of the Santa Ana River, the San Gabriel River, LA River, and the like. There aren't many of those fans left because the rivers and creeks have been dammed, but it's a tool by which to get us to do one thing: protect that animal. And also, when you do it, you make flood control a different kind of beast. What we have done in Los Angeles, what we have done in Denver and lots of places, Phoenix and El Paso and San Antonio, is to concretize rivers so that we can flush the water away from whatever it is we're trying to protect. But if you've got an endangered species in a place that you do that, you slow that process down. And why does that matter? Because when you put up levees, think about New Orleans, then we build up right against that protective device. I fly over Sacramento, which has levees everywhere. Houses are right up against the edge. fly over any of these southwestern cities that have sculpted those alluvial rivers into concrete casings. Houses come right up to the edge. Well, what happens if those levees crack? You explode, as New Orleans shows us, in a way that was really detrimental to human behavior. That kangaroo rat or some species that inhabits it suddenly becomes a way for us to protect ourselves in addition to the animal. It's a very self-serving thing. I like that part of the argument.
Go on, Aaron.
Yeah, no, thank you, Professor. Can you maybe talk a little bit about alien species and invasive species, because it
Yeah,
doesn't really get a lot of conversation,
yeah,
especially in south of, let's say, or Santa Barbara, because like the complete explosion of cheat grass
yep, yep.
and Jdapata grass, which are I don't think people kind of connect, because it doesn't make sense to most normal people anywhere else, that
Of
because you
course.
see landscapes and mountains and that makes sense that it goes on fire, but you don't realize that the ultimate power of the fuel source
Yes,
are these lower
yes.
grasses. And I remember as a kid, growing up where we did a lot of, I was fire explorer, and we did a bunch of other stuff like Junior Sierra, all that stuff, and back in the day. And I didn't know any of this either, but we
Mhm.
were taught, actually we were taught through burning, right? Like they actually
Yeah,
showed us
yeah,
the
yeah,
fuel differential of these non-native grasses and the oil composition. I mean, basically you're putting the equivalent of a micro fossil fuel on the landscape and just lighting it up with natural heat and a
yeah,
convection process.
yeah,
So
yeah,
anyways, if you
yeah.
could tell us about that, maybe.
Well, part of the problem with cheatgrass, which is a Western problem, not a Southern California one alone, is that this species loves grazing, because it's the way by which it gets spread, and also that it can outdominate and convert landscapes so radically. And if you burn it, it loves fire. If you plow it up, it loves being plowed. If you try to cut it down, you can't get it out. I mean, it's a horrific and thus very difficult thing to change. And so part of what we need to be working on, it seems to me, is those kinds of things. Also, if you had the federal dollars to do so, and you had the will, the political will to sort of change some of that. At the moment, I don't think that's going to happen after tomorrow. Um, and it's problematic. We're confronted with a lot of such issues, and I think it's going to be unending, and these things are going to keep popping up.
All right. Ken, just stop the recording for a second.
I'll be right back.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay. All right. 1, 2, 3. Go on, Ralph.
Thank you. I want to ask a very specific geographic kind of climate-related question. I have a nephew who lives in Irvine, California, in Orange County, and he's often said that he lives in a kind of a climate sweet spot. And I asked him a few days ago, expecting him to see smoke and smelling, and he says, "No, blue skies." So I'm just wondering what you can say about, where he lives in terms of all this.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So for those who don't know Southern California, Irvine is in the Orange County. So it is essentially sort of south and west of downtown LA, and thus of the major fires. The Orange and Irvine is a massive planned community in the 1960s and 70s. The Irvine family and foundation just built this extraordinary space. There's a University of California campus there, the UCI. And I love that he thinks he's in a climate sweet spot because the Santa Ana Hills and other mountain ranges that lie immediately to Irvine's north have burned routinely. I don't know how long your nephew has been there, but the Santiago Canyon is one of these places, one of these funnel places where Santa Ana winds just go roaring through 60, 70 miles an hour and then get channeled through a canyon, which then accelerates them even faster. And that canyon has burned, I don't know, 5 or 6 times in the last 5 or 6 years. I keep waiting, I mean, in a dreadful sort of way, for it to erupt again, because we're about to get more Santa Ana winds, and that mountain range, that sort of inland coastal range, is expected to be one of the funnel sites. The dilemmas are that we tend to live in a place of denial. And so if you listen to some of the commentary from people in Palisades and Eaton Canyon, or any fire over the last 20 years, Northern California, Southern California, Portland, Oregon, I don't care where it was, the first instinct for many is to say, I never expected this. I had no idea that this could happen. Even if the previous year a nearby canyon had burned, for some reason our canyon won't. Our ridgeline won't. Our mountain town won't. Our foothills won't. Our cities won't. But of course they will. These are fire ecosystems. The West has always burned. And it will continue to burn. I mean, Los Angeles is a place that's been burning for millennia, partly because indigenous people have done so. Lewis and Clark, as they worked their way across the northern plains into and through the Rockies and down into Washington, registered lightning strikes and the fires that lightning strikes created. Thousands of them. So nature has ignited stuff. Arson has ignited stuff. Accidents have happened. Utilities wires have broken routinely. Most of the large fires in California have come from high voltage wires that have snapped in winds that they didn't anticipate could happen there, except that they have. So lots of institutions, like lots of people, have forgotten that Orange County's mountains have burned routinely in the past and in the present. So I will hope for your nephew that it doesn't burn for some period of time. But in fact, the wind patterns make it possible so that I mean, I can see columns of smoke from the Eaton fire. I can't smell it, and that's my metric until I start looking at the air quality index. And then I realize that, in fact, my air quality has deteriorated because the winds have shifted, and now some of that fine particulate matter is now roaming over Claremont. And this morning I woke up and for my morning walk, I wore a mask for the first time in some time because this stuff kills you. And you can't see it, and it's terrifying. And we should talk about reconstruction, not just as a financial thing, although it's that. It's how we're going to reconstruct, but that may be another conversation.
Thanks very much.
Sure. Thank you, Ralph.
Go on, Michael.
Yeah. The two questions, but the main point is that you talked about the basically opposing these type of what's going to happen tomorrow, being in opposition to this new regime and what they're going to do concerning these issues. But I was wondering about your opinion about what happens if we're going into, because in the past, we're going into a new era, so to speak. If we're going into a proto-fascist situation or an oligarchy, where the opposition that we normally, the opposition methodology that we normally would take just isn't going to work because we don't have that kind of control. And when you get a substantial portion, even if it's not a majority, of the population who is in agreement, well, that's what fascism is, when you're in agreement with this type of oligarchic situation. And and you have also another substantial part of the population that is just caught up in whether or not they're going to lose TikTok or something. What do you do in those situations? Because it seems to me that the only thing that can prevent it is when the whole country starts burning. So what can you do to counter that situation for issues such as this? And the other thing is, it really has to do with the balance of nature, because to be quite honest, as soon as human beings do anything, as soon as they light a match, they're in opposition to the natural order of things. So how, in other words, striking that right balance between human intervention and nature just pursuing its natural course? Those are two separate questions. Sorry about that.
And they're huge. So let me try some of this. Let's not comply in advance. Let's not assume that the oligarchy, which, I mean, one used to laugh about Putin's oligarchs. It turns out we got our own, and they're bellying up to the beast and kissing the ring and doing all of those other fun things. But, you know, then you go local. I mean, that's what we did between 2017 and 2020, which is to focus on state legislatures. You focus on city halls and elsewhere to sort of push where you can push. And then, you know, my wife and I fund as many of these sort of organizations that have way greater expertise than either of us has, to do what we can as we can. But I don't want to say that this situation, though it appears dire, is as dire as it is, because then that undercuts the capacity to respond. And your second question, if you could reframe it a bit, Mike, so I can remember it.
Oh, I was just saying that if you just go by what nature does, as soon as humans have some sort of intervention, as soon as humans act in any way whatsoever, they are interfering in shall we say, nature's path. The natural.
Yes. Okay, so let's remind ourselves from biology that all species, not just human beings, manipulate their environment. Every single one, even amoebas. So this is not to sanction, well, if that's true, then whatever. It is to suggest, however, that there is no natural way exactly that exists unto itself. Everything manages in various ways to convert landscapes, even lava, maybe even especially lava. Earthquakes convert landscapes in ways that are remarkable. The dilemma for us is that we have unleashed a variety of disruptive behaviors that have channeled in a way that we're watching already in real time as sea level rises, as fires intensify, as the Santa Ana winds, which when I was an undergraduate here in Claremont in the early 1970s came in September, October, and early November, and we actually got rain in the 70s. Well, now those Santa Anas and their intensity has shifted, and that's why the National Weather Service said, well, we've never had these before. At the same time, these three central interventions. Well, that's because the Santa Anas have shifted, and the estimate is this may be climate related in some fashion. So we have had a dynamic impact on the lands that we inhabit, the places that we call home. And yet we've got policies that have shaped these things. And I'm enough of a hopeful soul, not optimistic, but hope. And I think hope is a very different thing from smiley face optimism. That if there are policies that we have done and behaviors that we have manifest, we can change both. And I don't think the federal government is the only place where that alteration takes place. That's our dilemma, that we got hit by the shiny thing of Washington and don't look at Sacramento. We don't look at the state capitals. We don't look at City Hall. We don't think about the county supervisors. They have controls that the Congress does not have, and the White House can't intervene, as Trump has discovered in the courts. So, I mean, he can have the Supreme Court do what it wants, but at some point the Supreme Court goes, you know what, that's New York's court. That's not us. We don't control that stuff. So there are places where we can intervene. There are ways in which we can sort of ratchet down our behavior. It partly starts with us individually, but most especially, it crucially resides in us collectively. And we've got to build those collective organizations. They're already there. Dear God, we had 4 years of this guy already. We know what the drill is, and we need to go back into that more militant mode to pursue the ends that we think will justify to create the world that we want to live in.
Right on, Char. Okay, go on, Kenny. You have to unmute, Ken.
Unmute and add pen. Okay. Oh, hi. It's fascinating, Char. Really educational. I got 3 questions. Which state in the United States and the mainland do you feel is addressing it most positively? And then which country, is there any country in the world that's got a similar ecosystem that's doing a better job or an acceptable job? And the last question is, you say there's lots of organizations and the people involved in them are aware of them, but for everybody else, where would you go to find out what to do to act on a local basis to do this thing with the state, the city, the region, the county? Where's the guidance? Where do you go for that? What to get that organization done?
Yeah, there's lots of questions embedded even in those 3 questions. So let me try to do this off the cuff, but I hope helpfully. If you want to think about states that are doing that are thinking about resilience and sustainability, come up with all of that language that describes what they're trying to do within their jurisdictions. I would point to Washington, Oregon, and California in different ways are all sort of structured themselves and have been moving in protective ways to sustain themselves against the onslaught that's about to come. The New England states have been doing a great job in the same way. And depending on where you see it, a place like Virginia, which is divided, they've got a mega governor, but a very strong state legislature, which at the moment is democratically controlled. And that's one of the places, by the way, if you want to intervene at a state level, Virginia has off-cycle elections. They're coming up next year. And over the last 7 years, I work with a group called the States Project.org or com, I guess it is. It's an extraordinary group. And we've been intervening. They've been intervening because they're really good at this, but we've been raising money for them. And Virginia is our target state next year because of the off-state elections. If you can get Virginia and hold it, you can then stop all of this bullshit about trans people and LGBT and all of these environmental deregulations that will be happening at various states that are interested in so doing. So there's a way to think about geography and political geography as you start to, sort of slice it up. Not every city in California is as enlightened and as progressive as, let's say, the Bay Area and Los Angeles is. But that's where I live and that's where I hang out. And I am, fortunate to live in a pretty progressive small town of 35,000. We've got our struggles. But the state has committed, for example, just thinking about housing, affordable housing, the state is using a preemption clause, which stops towns like Irvine, for example, and Claremont from refusing to build affordable housing and refusing to build housing aimed at the unhoused. And despite the sort of emotion, and in fact, you can't use emotional arguments according to this new state preemption, but my house value, I really don't want them here. You can't do that, right? It's off the books. So there are ways in which some of the social issues that we would like to address, and California is racked with a homelessness issue or set of issues, we're making headway on it. In part because the state says you got to, and partly because communities have they've tried to break that law and they lost. So now we're doing it. And that takes time, but it's worth the time to get the response. So there's sort of at local levels and at a state level, I think there are ways, if you happen to live in the places that I suggested, you're in good shape, but you also need to keep the pressure on, because that's the mechanism by which Trump hopes to succeed, that will back off and say, oh, crap. That's the last thing one should do. And your last question, Ken, was what?
Well, you partially addressed it when you mentioned the states. You said
the States Project. Yeah.
statesproject.com.
Yeah, it's a phenomenal group.
Okay. And do you find that there's any country with a
country
that's everybody's going to say Sweden, Norway, I don't know.
Yeah. Well, sure, Norway. Because that's where they rake the forest, as we heard in the last term, and which is why they don't have forest fires. Actually, they're getting forest fires, as is Finland, as is Sweden, places that aren't supposed to burn are burning, as I mentioned early on. So what's interesting about other places, and let me use Europe as an example, and then I want to talk about the Mediterranean ecosystems and their fire zones, which are global in their reach and context. During the Great Depression, one of the places that everybody looked on in the Democratic Party, especially the Democratic left, and those who were farther to the left, they were looking for examples, and where they went was Scandinavia, to the Nordic countries, because there was a system of Social Security already. There were all of these other kinds of social net responses, and in part are and served in a way as exemplars for what we could do. My first book is about the Bingham family, one generation of which, Alfred Bingham, in the 1930s, created in New York a magazine called Common Sense that was sort of positioned itself between Roosevelt on the one hand and the Communist Party on the other, CPUSA. And what he kept talking about is like, look at what the Europeans are doing, particularly the Nordic states. We should be looking at that because that's the way to get us to something we don't have. Turns out we still don't have it. And so I would look to them as sort of as potential, no place is perfect. They're not all paragons, but they have done things in terms of social life and social networking, and social beneficence. High taxes, yes, but look at what you get for them. The other piece is looking at those areas. And again, let's take fire as an example. It's happening in places where it didn't used to happen. And the examples of that I would urge those for whom this is true, they should look at Australia, they should look at South Africa, like California and Chile and the Mediterranean ecosystems of the Mediterranean basin. They're all the same kind of landscapes. They've got different kind of wind patterns, they burn at different times, but they all burn. And if the planet is getting hotter and thus in the process more burnable, then where I would look for examples of how to do it is, say, for example, Australia. I've been on a couple of Australian televisions, and one of the things I say is that your fire history and ours is the same, virtually the same. And if you look at their millennia-old fire systems, the Aboriginals of Australia burned with the exact same regularity as the indigenous peoples of the greater southwest of the United States, and for the exact same reasons. The fire service in Australia, both provincial and state, has started to adapt the traditional ecological knowledge about fire that has been there since the British invaded. And it's something that we're a little more reluctant to do, but we should also imagine it. I don't know how the Mediterranean states are responding, but then that becomes part of how I would say, if I was the Russian Forest Service, for example, watching these big fires go, maybe there's a way to think about what it is that other Aboriginal people once did now that Russia and northern Canada, the boreal forests, are burning in a way that's not been seen in contemporary human history anyway. We've got a lot, we can learn a lot from other people. And that's not tended to be how the United States functions. But I think it is a way that these are global phenomena. And other people have ways of thinking about these issues that we don't, and we need to borrow them or investigate and utilize as best we can.
Thank you. And please raise your hands if you want to ask a question. I want to ask you something that has to not do with fire, but with hurricanes. And you mentioned this question of how public opinion, the states project. Well, if one looks at Florida, one looks at Louisiana, one looks at just what happened up in North Carolina, you're going through these red states with these tremendously terrible weather conditions that many of us, of course, will argue are enhanced by global climate change. Yet, this doesn't translate into the politics at the grassroots in these particular states, and certainly in the election. So what do you make of that? What do you make of the disconnect between the reality that this is getting worse and that you still have these political tendencies that haven't made that connection, in fact, glory in their desire to not make this connection? What do you make of all that?
Well, it's even worse than glory in it. The governor of Florida has refused to use the words climate change, but keep in mind, so did the George W. Bush administration. No federal official under W's president could use the concept, could use climate change. They could say changing climate. They couldn't use climate change. And we go, God, rhetorically, that's stupid. But for the federal agencies, it was like, all right, you want the semantics? We'll use it and still make the claims. So what are we going to do? Florida, at least the lower third of it is going to disappear by the end of this century. And I don't give a damn what they do. Sea level rise is going to make Florida a different shape. And I have family there, and my urging of them to think about what this means for the rest of their lifetime and whether they want to actually have that nice, lovely house close to the beach in Florida may not be the smartest thing in the world. Look, the politics, the stupid politics, let me put it kindly, doesn't matter. These places are going to get whacked repeatedly by hurricanes. The politics matters in terms of how one thinks about reconstruction in Los Angeles, let alone in Dade County or the western counties of Florida that have been blasted for the last couple of years, or in Puerto Rico when Maria ripped through and Trump went over and started throwing bottles of water. That fucking moron. It's depressing what this man thinks of is as funny. But that's why we got to push. And in Florida, it's really hard. I have colleagues who teach in Florida state universities that are being utterly gutted because of this. And so part of what you got to shake your head, because there are these natural forces that are going to overwhelm even that political argument in the end. And that's an end we don't want to have happen, but that's a one that they're basically both glorying in, as you said, Jim, and are going to suffer from. I don't know what the antidote to that is, except to write books like Burn Scar, to work with colleagues who are working on this. I've got another collection of essays that sort of use the Eastern the Appalachians as a way to think about some of these issues. And there are some that are looking at the role that hurricanes have in the Gulf Coast and in Puerto Rico. My job is to both teach this stuff, but also to write. And I love that combination. And I see events like this as part of the educational mission. But I suspect I'm speaking to the converted. It's just a guess. But that also means, yeah, I know. But that's why the converted have to keep talking publicly about what needs to be converted. And we don't have the public voice in the White House any longer, and we don't much in Congress, though we can do stuff to make that work. But that's why, again, it becomes down to the local and the state that you're in, and just fight like hell, because we don't have any option. This is an existential crisis, both globally on the one hand, and also in the communities that we reside in. And to fail on sort of articulating that crisis is to invite larger failures.
And I see Sally has unmasked. Sally, do you want to ask something? No. You do? Do you want to have a question or anything like that? Okay. I'm putting you on the spot. Okay. And one thing you do say, I'm very happy that you emphasize the need to be positive about all this, because I saw the Washington Post had a poll about how most Americans are not down for the Trump agenda, and that contrary to public opinion. And we'll see what happens tomorrow, because I think we're going to get overwhelmed this week with a blizzard of craziness. Now,
go ahead.
One thing I want to ask you, and again, anyone who asks a question, because now I'm going to ask questions that have to do with Los Angeles, and I am not an Angelino. I'm a New Yorker. Trump is no big mystery to me. He's been an open book for many years. But I want to ask you about the response in Los Angeles. I've been following it pretty carefully, and I want to get your sense of what has happened. As I mentioned today, the Washington Post had an article about how ill-prepared the fire department was. They talked about how they actually had put in to create a hotshot kind of response locally to wildfires, and they just were not able to get, I think they got it off the ground in sort of a partial militia fashion, if you will. So Tuesday and Thursday, these guys would be mobilized, but they were calling to form 3 or 4 hotshot units. And for those of us who are now familiar with this, the hotshot units are basically deployed into these fires to essentially directly attack them with all sorts of methods. And yet this was not adopted. And then you had other issues coming up about the question of the water. Now, obviously, I've looked at some of the incredible footage of what happened at Palisades. Unbelievable. You know, literally dozens of structures in the horizon burning. And so I can understand easily how they ran out of fire. But what is your sense of what happened there so far from your perspective? What the success and failures of what we're seeing here, and of course the political aspect of this.
Let me unpack it as best I can. One of the things to remember about these Santa Ana winds is their speed. This is more than hurricane strength wind, blasting into and up and over and through the passes of the San Gabriel Mountains, funneling along the Santa Monica Mountains where the Palisades were located. So a couple of things come from that. And let me sort of etch out that Tuesday as a way to think about it from my vantage point. I was going out to driving out to the desert, 130, 140 miles, to bear witness to Biden designating the 𝗔𝗂𝗏 National Monument. Beautiful desert landscape. The SUV I was driving, not my car, but I borrowed this big thing because I knew it was going to be windy. I had no idea what I was running into. I was running into 70-mile-an-hour winds on Interstate 10. The SUV, which is infinitely heavier than my Subaru, my Prius, was just getting blasted. Every 18-wheeler I was seeing was on the verge of jackknifing, which scared the crap out of me. And by the time I got to the 𝗔𝗂𝗏, the winds were so fierce that they couldn't even bring Biden in on a helicopter. I didn't know at that point, because this was like 10 o'clock in the morning, that was significant. So I wheel around because they canceled it. I'm coming back, and then dust storms, brownouts, basically buried Interstate 10. And everybody, all of us, slowed down to 10 miles an hour because you couldn't see a damn thing. And I finally, once I got out of the brownout, my phone started exploding with the evacuation orders. So for about 170 miles, Interstate 10 has been a partial funnel for these winds that were blowing in. The second thing, so that's what ripped into those two fire zones early on that day, 10 o'clock, 10:30 or so, when the fire began in the Palisades. And then I watched the fire start in Eaton because it was publicized. I mean, you could watch it unfold. And at that moment, I knew game over. This was going to be horrific. Why? Because the Santa Anas that are coming through the passes were only part of the wind force that came. The other is that the winds also just simply ignored the passes and hit the San Gabriel Mountains to the north of LA on a perpendicular and came up and over the mountains into what's called a mountain wave of wind, which operates in a very different way, but much like water coming downstream, hits a boulder and it starts to move. It goes up and over it, it flows around it, and suddenly that wind is going in places where you don't expect to have it. We had an event like that in 2020 in Claremont, just leveled this city of trees, just totally tore it apart. There was no fire involved, thank God. But this wind is moving so fast that any fire that erupted in Eaton and or in the Palisades was unstoppable. I don't care how many hotshot crews you had. I don't care how many fire engines you had. I don't care how much water you had. Game over. For the first 24 hours, there was no way to fight this fire. The wind was such that it's burning, by one estimate, 300 yards a minute. It's not burning vegetation. Go look at the video. It's burning rooftop to rooftop to rooftop to rooftop. And the moment it hits the roof and the attic, the game is off. You don't fight that fire because that fire is won already. You start moving things around to try to do it. So here's the infrastructure and the personnel are totally out of sync. I went up to visit a field trip to the 1991 Oakland Hills fire, which was as desperate, as dangerous as this fight, but not quite as so. Firefighters who did it led us on this trip, who fought that fire. And they told us two stories. The first of which is that at 10 miles wind speed, they're firefighters. Anything over 30, they're observers. At 100 miles an hour, get the fuck out of the way. Because there's nothing you can do. You could have all the reservoirs you wanted. And what you would do is spray water that would come back and hit you in the face. If you watch the video of that wind speed, you know full well the last thing you want to do is send anybody up against it because there's the topography in the Palisades particularly. It is rugged. It is 80-degree slopes in some places. There's no way to get boots on the ground. So what you do is you hold the ground where you can. The dilemma is so intense that, you know, the finger pointing about whether the equipment should have been pre-positioned or not, frankly, if the equipment had been pre-positioned at the higher levels, those firefighters would have died. The thing that staggers me, and I don't mean to deny the loss of death, the loss of life. 27 at the moment, it may cycle up, I'm sure, is how many people got out. We had friends who lived in the Upper Palisades. We have friends up in Altadena who've lost their homes. Some of them lived in areas that when I would visit them, I would go, I think I should do a social intervention because this is way too dangerous. And they got out. I don't know how they did it, to be honest. And so some of, you know, at the political level and the like is mind-blowing to me. But equally mind-blowing is the fact that the governor and the mayor have said, we will rebuild as fast as possible. And to make that possible, we're going to reduce environmental regs so that you can get up there, and then they start using the Republican trope of red tape. Those regulations are there for a reason. And to reduce them or to put them aside for a period of time defeats the opportunity for those of us who think there's a different way to do this to have a voice in the conversation. But instead, the argument is rebuild fast. And I get the emotional impulse. Are you going to go tell people, nah, you can't rebuild for the next 3 to 5 years because, you know, we need to think this through. But I think there are alternatives to this process that could be affected had other things happened. And the optics would be terrible for the mayor to say, now, hold on, take a pause. Let's wait 5 years because I've got another idea for how this should play. But in fact, it may take 5 years anyway. All of the infrastructure has been compromised, if not destroyed. And I don't just mean utility wires, roads, sewer lines, gas lines, storm drains, all of that has been cooked at 1,000 degrees. The toxicity of that soil, of every tree, of all of those streets, all of those sidewalks, there's ash everywhere. That stuff you do not want to breathe. So before they fire up a single bulldozer, which the mayor would suggest by that policy should happen soon, it can't happen soon. All of those areas have to be cleaned in a way that we can't even imagine. And where's that landfill going to go? I mean, I've got a film for people who want to be depressed that you should watch. It's called Tar Creek, and it's about an area in northeastern Oklahoma. It's a brilliant documentary about a rural area with really good natural resources that during World War I and World War II were pumping out rare earth metals and other kinds of things. Well, the chit piles, as they call them, the tailings, are these football field size, 200 feet tall things that kids used to sled down as their playground. Well, this stuff is toxic. And while they carved out the soil to get this, they basically left little pillars that held up these towns, and there's sinkholes everywhere. If you want another film about Southern California and the fires of California, Lucy Walker, who's the director, writer, put out something during the pandemic, so it disappeared. It's called Bring Your Own Brigade. It's a great film. I spent a day with her near Ventura, California, sort of walking through areas that had burned and not burned and sort of talking about this stuff. But, there are ways by which we can educate about are these issues. But we've also silenced that conversation because the growth issue and the need to repair is an instant gratification that, unfortunately, I think is wrongly placed.
Yeah, thank you.
I see two more questions.
Yeah, thank you. And it also raises a question which would be interesting for a future conversation with yourself and others about these houses that survived. And I have a feeling that they're probably extremely costly. And how would the average person be able to afford that? There's all and then the question of how you deal with the housing issue in general in Los Angeles, the housing issue in general in the country, and all sorts of interesting questions that we know are not going to be dealt with in the next 4 years unless people push back. Eric.
Right. Thank you. Can you maybe talk about a couple of things, which I don't think people outside of that area will kind of appreciate. One is, because of whatever the disjointed, nonlinear weather seasonality we have now versus maybe the ones that we grew up with there, right? So then let's say whatever that steady state was, that was the norm, put it that way. That there's always been this really kind of thermostatic, almost harmonics that we're used to. Dry, then we get wet, and then it slowly dries up, then it gets hot, and then it gets wet again. That you can, you sort of base all your decision making on, the sort of, we'll call it the linear view of what it was, and that's clearly fairly disrupted right now. Right. And so, so isn't there? And I'm just setting the stage for that. Isn't there a lot of risk right now that I just don't see a lot of people discussing, that with these tens of thousands of structures, and people don't realize it's maybe 20,000-30,000 structures destroyed, but there's structural damage maybe to 50,000, and stuff people don't even know is damaged, right? They come home, all their stuff turns on, they don't realize they have a vent that's broken or whatever, and you have to replace a whole side, or it's been partially damaged through wind, or branches plunging into your roof or whatever. that you're going to have a huge material waste problem right now. And if and when, it should happen already, but let's say it's a month or two from now, you get some powerful rains in,
Yep.
you're talking, hundreds of millions of pounds of material that basically become, mudslide, debris, what do they call it? Fields, I guess it is. Yeah. Like, moving mudslide debris fields, which are insanely toxic and dangerous, very much like you had during Katrina. I mean, actually, on a scale that's probably
larger.
Larger. And it's actually so that's one question. The second question, I think this is sort of important, is that everybody looks at this as like there's an LA. And if you're not from there, it totally makes sense, right? Everyone thinks LA is the whole county. LA is the city and the basin, which is this carve out, which is about a quarter of, around a quarter-ish of all of LA County. And so LA City Fire and LA City is different than LA County and the incorporated and unincorporated areas. Now they have obviously mutual aid and, they work hand in glove, but that's when there's like a small structure fire or there's a big car crash or a truck flips over or a bridge burns. When you're talking about objectively sort of a military level operation, I think that's part of the problem. Isn't there really a requirement now that CAL FIRE becomes, in essence, the reserve state fire authority at a true, manned, person level, with the surge capacity, so that you really have, what I would almost call theater armies, right? I have a friend of mine who's a Division 4 fire chief, actually for CAL FIRE. He was LA County for 30 years, and then we grew up together in Pasadena, Altadena, and his house burned down, actually, or his family's house burned down too. And but isn't there a requirement that you really have to start thinking in terms of this in sort of more militarized operations at scale? I don't mean necessarily the military, like having a 4-star general, but a fire equivalent, which is very unique. It's a unique use case or problem set versus anything else. The only thing we have near that is when there's these, super fires in Montana, et cetera, which we tend to sort of try to manage through over months, which you can't really do in large urban interface areas. So because your goal is to collapse the months, if you just let it burn, right? It's like COVID, right? You just let it go. Yeah. I mean, it'll burn out eventually, but you'll take a lot with you, right? And so your goal is to collapse that down to weeks. And I think that's another issue. I think people have an expectation when they call the fire department because their kitchen's on fire, it will likely be out while you're still on the phone, fumbling around, freaking out in your house. There will be literally 4 firefighters that, basically punching through your kitchen and ripping it apart and basically putting it out in, less than 5 to 7 minutes since you've been on the phone, if not sooner than that. So we have this sort of expectation that's what it is. Whereas with these woodland-like fires, when you can't do anything about them, they burn for months, and when you can do something about them, maybe you get it down to weeks. And isn't that something we have to sort of confront, that, you might need this larger fire authority, whatever you'd call it, West Fire, for the West, I don't know, something much larger that has a much more super state, or at least large state authority. And it prepositions resources and attacks, it actually attacks the fire architecture over time and actually pre-mitigates, and has authority to do that, right? So if somebody's putting up a wood fence up to the foothills in Altadena, they come in and it's like, you have 1 week to get rid of this, or we're getting rid of it, right? And one way or the other, it's not going to be here because you're basically not generating fuel, right? And so the human-made fuel you have to eliminate, and then you could start to try to build fire breaks. And I guess that's my whole point, is that, do you think we have the Overton window moved enough that there is this type of thinking? Because I haven't heard anybody, at any level, Democrat or Republican, it doesn't matter, that talks like this. It's rebuild immediately, and no one's talking about, well, we could get 5 inches of rain in the next 3 months, and that's a problem, and so on. So I'm just I'm not seeing anything. They all feel kind of frozen right now. What's your take on? I have those two big questions.
I think you answered half of your question already. Part of what to think about is that some of those authorities already exist. Tuesday night, as the Eden Fire took off, every single freeway in California and entering California was filled with mutual aid participants from Arizona, New Mexico, Northern California, Nevada, Utah. Firefighters have flown in from Quebec, who just finished off fighting that boreal forest last year, forest fire. The number of people that were on the ground Wednesday as opposed to Tuesday is astonishing, and that's part of this larger process. The Forest Service obviously was involved, even though it doesn't have any land where the Altadena fire is on the Angeles, or was partially on the Angeles, mostly on the county. So I think the bodies and the equipment started moving instantly. I mean, part of the other problem, and I've talked with firefighters in Oakland about that fire and with them subsequently, for a single structure fire, you roll out 3 to 5 engines. If you've got 1,000 structures burning simultaneously, there's not enough fire engines within 500 miles, within 1,000 miles, that could have collapsed onto this situation. So the infrastructure, gone, right? It was going to go in this context anyway. If there could be a more top-down managed process, I think you run into the nature of sovereignty in the United States, which is fragmented in multiple pieces all over the place, all the way down to the district fire offices, fire departments in and around the Palisades. I don't think, again, I'll go back to this. I don't care what the structure is. This fire just burnt through it.
Yeah, no, one other quick little point, and Alex, I'll let you go immediately after, is that, and this is something I've not seen anyone, my friend brought it up, that's CAL FIRE. So there's 250,000 pools, like home private owned pools in Southern California.
Yep.
And, average 20, 30,000 gallons, blah, blah, blah. The history has always been basically for helo airlift, and those are pre-designated pools. There's, however, few thousand of those around, Southern California that are sort of pre-picked, and they actually write you a check for that. People don't realize that because basically it's toxic, right? So you got to clean it out and all that stuff. But that is a powerful resource that, and there's clearly an innovation cycle, technology innovation cycle around pool pumps. And we talked about it here, Jim, and some others, that I think is sort of underutilized. And I don't mean just that as one sliver, but, let's say there's like 50 of these sort of mini innovations, the bottom up, let's say, not just the top down approach. I'm wondering, do you think this is going to, lead to more of a, what you might call a blending of sort of democratic, I don't mean, like big D, but small d, democratic tech bro meets problem solution space fit, kind of the bottom up, and then maybe a little more top down, and inside there might be something that works more effectively than this.
Yeah,
response.
The dilemma, of course, and I heliTAC is really crucial. They can't fly at 40 miles.
Yeah, they can't fly above 30. Yeah.
So game over. And this has been true in Southern California, at least, and my records go back to the late 1970s, early 80s, where big fires could not get aerial in. And for those who aren't living here as Aaron and I are, you can't fight this kind of fire unless you have aerial support. The topography is too terrible. The fire is moving fast. If you want to hit it, you can use every single reservoir you want, except that you can't get to it because you can't fly. So that meant you just totally took out the essential mechanism by which you fight in very steep topography and the like. Yeah, I think there's a lot of different ways of doing it. One of the things that for me is a stopgap measure, because it looks like they're going to rebuild anyway, is on those beautiful ridge lines where the county and or city owns land. I would put the biggest, ugliest tank you could possibly, water tank that you could possibly build. They'll hate it until they need it. But you put it there also as a symbol of what you're moving into. And the realtors have to say, see that tank? It's going to save your ass someday. You may not want to look at it. You may want to put trees up there to frame it, which would be dumb. But put them up there in part because, and the Santa Monica Mountains are a good example of why this is necessary. It wasn't that they didn't have water, they didn't have water pressure. So if you had 20, 40,000 gallon tanks who could flush into the hydrants at the higher elevation using gravity to go down so you don't need electricity, the water's already in the tank. You might have been able to fight that fire, though I think at that extreme flame lengths of 200 to 300 feet, the intensity of that fire, which is 1,000 degrees or more, keep that in mind, folks. This thing is not only moving fast, it's scorching. It's literally the air was on fire, or put it another way, the wind was fire. That's hard to conceive of until you look at the video and you realize that wind isn't just carrying it, it is a flamethrower itself. And yet we could do, we can tweak around the edges. Those pools are pre-designated. We've had small fires in Claremont, brush fires, they got to every single school, because every single school has also got a designated tank. And you watch them drop that down and fly in and do this. I mean, it's the choreography is unbelievable. But the choreography was not possible for the first 36 hours. And that's where we are at this point. I'm disappointed the governor and mayor did what they did. But so we got to push that somehow. I'm not sure how. I mean, I know what the policy should be. They just haven't asked.
Yeah, thank you, Char. I had a friend who literally lost his house in that 1991 fire.
Yeah.
And one of the things I intend to do is I intend to get on the people who are actually involved in this aerial firefighting business. It's quite fascinating to me.
Yeah, totally.
The guys down in Phoenix, the guys who run that DC-10 operation, I have them in my target line. So anyway, we'll sort of wrap up here. Sally, go on. Sally has not said anything yet. Go on, Sally.
Hi, thank you for this incredible, edifying talk. I live in the Hollywood Hills, so I am one of the people in the most temporarily charmed existence of all time, in that I am incredibly close, like a 10-minute walk from the Sunset Fire that started. And because there was no wind, this is just a perfect example of how the wind, to your earlier point, is a deal breaker or not. Because we had so little wind, and I think it was Wednesday night.
Yep.
It's all a blur.
Closer to Thursday.
Yes. The helicopters are flying over my house, very low. There was hardly any wind. The Hollywood Reservoir, Lake Hollywood, is just over the ridge to the east. And boom. I mean, they made this scientifically perfect drop, and just, it was a beautiful thing to see. I did have to evacuate, and I was fine, and everything's fine. But I wanted to make one other point, and forgive me if it's already been talked about, but Montecito, California.
Good.
Big fires. And more catastrophically than anything to follow, mudslides that killed people in the most horrific ways, including friends of friends. Like the visceral horror of that. It's my biggest fear, being buried alive, by the way. But anyway, so
Yeah.
I'm wondering, how are they going to expedite building when both of these communities, Altadena, beloved Altadena, and the Palisades, such beautiful places, but they're built, right into the hills and up into how can they do this without, I don't know. I mean, what's the protocol?
Yeah. So, God, you've got multiple questions here. First of all, the Sunset Fire was wall-to-wall coverage. It was look-away television, in part because you saw basically LAX being reinvented with airplanes and helicopters. Their approach, I mean, you just watch this choreography. It was unbelievable precisely because it had 20 miles an hour or less. So it's kind of amazing when it works. My God, it was stunning to watch. I've seen it a lot of times. It just is like, okay, so we can do this at some points, but you can't do it at others. Um, Montecito is a great example of it. It's the 2017 Thomas fire that burned Los Angeles, Ventura, and Santa Barbara counties. 3 counties running right along 101, took out Montecito. Those who evacuated, less than 2 weeks later, a 9-inch rainfall just slammed into the Montecito area and then just churned bodies and cars and trucks into the Pacific Ocean, where they found many of the victims for 30 miles away from where they had lived. This is an example to go back to something that Jim raised early on about whiplash weather, because that's something we're now experiencing. The worst thing that can happen to Los Angeles is to get any heavy rain now. Why? Because as Montecito showed, one of the things that fire does is to burn soil and leave behind a kind of waxy residue. The Forest Service has done tons of research on this. And there's even a suggestion that burned areas get more rain than non-burned areas, that it's almost like this attraction. And they don't know what the source is. The first sort of Forest Service people who did it was like, I don't know what's going on here, but something is about this that gets more rain. And Montecito was one of the places they went. And it hits this waxy soil. And if you think about water on wax, it moves. It moves a lot faster than an unburned area. And so I would like a nice gentle rain, 1/10 of an inch here, 1/20th of an inch there. Just slowly wet the place down, because anything more than that is going to run into storm drains. It's going to run off the hills. It's going to create landslides. And all of that material is going to end up in other people's houses. And keep in mind, all of that toxicity that goes up in the air has to come down somewhere. And so it's not only the watershed that we have to think about, it's the air shed that we also need to think about, which is why I'm now wearing a mask every time I'm outside, because anything over AQI 40, you're asking for it. It's hard to do. I was perfectly fine in the pandemic. This is a little harder because it looks clean, but it ain't. And it's not going to be clean for a long time. And I think that's the part that really hurts the American desire for instant gratification and change. As you said, Aaron, it's like you call the fire department, they're going to come. They can't. And the firefighters are like, after the 2018 Woolsey fire in Ventura County, which was way bigger than this one. 300,000 people were flushed out of their homes. Lots of things happened in the Santa Monica Mountains running into Ventura. Terrible. There's a wonderful after action report in which the firefighter says one of the dilemmas are that people think we're going to be there instantly and we can do everything always. We've got to learn to live in a different kind of world, because the climate disruption has so changed firefighting and the intensity of these worlds. The same would be flood control, like it's going to survive. Well, Katrina shows us just the complications that ensue, as does Puerto Rico and Hurricane Maria. We've got a lot of work to do. We've got a lot of issues that we've got to address. We can't do it in 2 hours, but I really appreciate the conversation.
Yes, indeed. And thank you so much for your time. Alex.
Yeah, sure. I wanted to ask about fire insurance, and both what you think, how do you think things need to change there in terms of, where you let people build, how much you how much is covered, but and also what do you think is realistically actually going to happen there as following these fires? Thanks.
Yeah, so insurance companies and federal insurance cannot be let, will not be let in floodplains of the Mississippi River Delta. Can't build in it. Because if you can't get insurance, well, you can, but you won't have insurance, and therefore you're taking your life into your own hands, and also your property might disappear without any recourse. So why do we not do the same in fire zones? Don't know the answer to that. I think that's part of what's going to be worked out. Imagine, at the moment, the scientists and economists as AccuWeather predict at the moment that it's going to cost 250 to 270 billion, not to reconstruct, but simply to pay off the issues that we need to pay off on. How many insurance companies are going to go for that? I don't care what they are and how much reserve they have. That's going to be a huge hit. So capital has a role to play in this, but so does policy. And I've been advocating since the Thomas fire. So here's my quick fix. Never going to happen, but here's my quick fix. What if we took that $250 billion that we're going to have to spend to reconstruct, and give me 50 billion of it. And then you go into the Palisades in Altadena and suggest to folks who might be interested in an alternative process. And if they're willing to sell, buy it. But it has to be willing sellers. It cannot be eminent domain. That's a political explosive issue that you would never succeed in. But if you offered to pay people what their house or their raw land is worth, then that's what you do. And what do you do with that property? You turn it into recreational zones. Many of the foothill communities along the 210 have done this on an ad hoc basis, not for fire protection, but to produce more recreational areas. In Claremont, we have a Claremont Wilderness Park, 3,000 acres. And here's local activism at work. They had no outside money initially. They said, we don't want another 2,000 houses up in the foothills. We need walking space. And built this coalition in the town that also generated some outside dollars. The city bought it. My college owned several hundred, maybe 500 acres up there, which it deeded to the city, which it could have sold. It could have built houses on and sold those for a whopping amount of money. Monrovia, California did it. Other towns have done it. And what it turns out to do is not only do you absent those people from potential fire and all the risks that come from it, but you build a buffer that firefighters can utilize to fight fires if they erupt in the wildland interface that is county owned and federally owned, so that you could get out of your house in time to leave. I mean, there have been fires, and it's a possible mechanism. So if the city, county of Los Angeles and the state of California put together a package whereby you could go to people in the Palisades and Altadena and Pasadena and say, look, you just burned. You don't need me to tell you what just happened. And for people my age, do I want to reconstruct my house and take a mortgage if I could get it? Insurance if I could get it? If you're retired or semi-retired as I am, it's like, I don't want another mortgage. Maybe selling makes more sense. For others who've just been burned out and went, okay, I get it now. I didn't get it when the Thomas fire happened. I didn't get it when the Woolsey fire happened. I didn't get it in November of this year when the mountain fire erupted in the same area. And I didn't get it in December when the Franklin fire, which this Palisades fire overburned, by the way. But now with the Palisades fire, I get it. I don't want to live in this place. I want to be where there are a lot of fire hydrants. And if someone were willing to buy me out, I'd be happy to do that. So if policy creates a bad result and human beings write policy, then let's write different policy that actually does what communities are supposed to do, which is protect health and safety. If that's our foremost ambition for the city, for the state, for the county, that's their job, then let's write policy that allows them to do that job, and also that we don't suffer as a consequence. Yes, 𝗓𝗪, someone just texted. Yeah, Robert, you're absolutely right. 𝗓𝗪 has burned 5 times, and the last parts of it have burned in the 2017, 2016, 5 major, maybe 6 major fires. And if you also want to map this on the geography, to go back to Aaron's point, look at the relationship between fires and freeways. Every single one of these fires, with the exception of parts of the Palisades, are framed around arterials and freeways. We have basically built infrastructure that allows the periphery of Los Angeles to move and move again and move again and move again, and every single time we move up into Hollywood and Brentwood and Bel Air, it burns. Every time we lap over that and down into the next valley in the San Fernando Valley, it burns. You take the 18 freeway, or you take the 5 or the 210 out to 𝗓𝗪, it burns. You go into the foothills of San Bernardino in 1980, the beautifully named Panorama Fire, because you were up on the foothills and you're watching the city of San Bernardino, looks exactly like Altadena. 300 houses burned in an instant. How did they build those houses? Because there were freeways that enabled easy on, easy off. We bring fire with us in the form of electric wires, in the form of cars, in the form of, I don't know, charcoal briquettes. Here's my favorite photograph of all. So go look for this. Right? Google Richard Nixon, Bel Air fire, roof. Richard Nixon is on his cedar shake roof in his brand new house in Bel Air, on a street that had been bulldozed 12 months before and houses put up on it. And he's up on his roof in a coat and tie, good look, with a hose in his hand, wetting down his roof. That neighborhood, no more than 18 months old. It burned. Why? Because people are there. Because we've got electricity in there, we've got bulldozers doing their thing, we've got cigarettes, whatever it is. We torch ourselves. So why are we building back in the landscapes that we know explode in fire? That's another optic that makes no sense to me. And it ought to be driving policymakers at the local, state, and even federal levels.
Yeah, this issue that Alex raised of insurance is extremely important.
Yeah, it is.
And frankly, it'd be great to have your assistance to get an interdisciplinary group of folks together to talk about this in an intelligent way.
Sure. And it's as true for Hurricane Alley as it is for fire zones, as it is for Tornado Alley, as it is for name your watershed.
Absolutely. Because as a historian, I know that I like to get into that nitty gritty of financial records. Michael, and then we'll sort of begin to wind down. Mike.
Yeah, I need to leave in a few minutes, so let's make this the last question, if I may.
Oh, I wish it were a better one. Okay. One of the things I'm particularly concerned about is, again, when you have fires, you get particles in the atmosphere and they spread all over the place. And you were alluding to that as far as wearing a mask and how healthy the air is going to be. But as opposed to natural fires in millennia past, when we have all these new types of materials that are burning, houses, etc., and the chemical particulars that are there, is there anything? I mean, if they're going to talk about rebuilding, and I hate to say it, but with a failed real estate person in the White House, they're probably, things aren't going to go too well. But if you're talking about rebuilding, I mean, is there any move to make sure that the chemicals, and I guess there's some that you're not going to be able to avoid, but that the materials that are used, which if they burn, go into the atmosphere and may be more toxic than natural materials even. Is there anything, any move being made to control that or deal with that?
Hold that thought for a second. Aaron, get in your last comment. Go on. Just unmute, Aaron.
Oh, no, thank you. One quick thing, and maybe you can just help people think about this, but most people don't know, even in LA, that the most destructive fire in its history is the Griffith Park fire in 1933. And maybe you can just talk about that a little bit. And, just as an example, even 100 years ago, almost 90 years ago, of the struggle in containing the fire. And that was right near the Dam Canyon area where all the water is, basically.
All right, thank you. Well, those will be the last questions. Go on, Char.
So the Griffith Park fire was not.
You're offline for some reason.
Really?
Yeah, your voice.
Can you not hear me?
There you go.
Okay. So the Griffith Park fire is not the most destructive. It was until the Camp Fire erupted, the most deadly of fires.
Well, yeah, that's what I meant. I mean, deadly to firemen.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what firefighters.
Yeah, I mean, it was.
That's what I meant. That's what I meant. Sorry.
The larger point is, here's this great recreational zone that burned, and horribly so, in a way that WPA crews who had no training whatsoever were forced to fight this fire, and they lost their lives.
Killed 29 firemen, and that governed the shift in all fire management for obvious reasons.
It's quite extraordinary. And then the question about the toxicity. Think about a house and Sally will probably watch this as I did, and those of you in LA did on that Thursday, I think it was, where the 4-story house that just imploded. And I mean, it was the most extraordinary thing to watch them try to put that fire out and the success they had. But I was watching that house because it was the one I could watch that started. You could watch it start, and then you could watch this 4-story thing ultimately implode on itself. The roof is petrochemical. The wood is treated with chemicals. The plumbing inside may have been plastic piping or copper. It melted, whichever it was. Every bit of furnishing, fire retardant, zoned, whatever they were, all of that stuff went up into the air. And then you're down to the driveway, and that petrochemical asphalt, whatever it may have been, the car burning, its tires, its hubs, its upholstery, its metal, the gasoline tank exploding and sending its petrochemicals up into the air. And that's one building. Now burn what, 8, 9, 10,000 structures? And this is an event that is like all of these other fires. And timber burning also puts in biochemicals, because that's what wood is, right? So but this was like, toxic heaven. And anything downwind is going to be damaged as a consequence. And depending on where the winds shift, that damage is going to spread much more beyond Altadena, Pasadena, and the Palisades. But that's true of any major fire and any major structure fire, which this is. This is not a wildland fire. This is an urban streetscape fire, and it demonstrated it by how it burned and what it burned.
Well, this has been absolutely marvelous. And Char,
thank you.
Thank you so much. This has really been very thoughtful and enlightening to all of us, and hopefully it will be to the folks who look at this. I see that VB could be Volker Bergen, because Volker actually experienced the 1943 bombing of Hamburg, which of course was caused a firestorm. Yep. And what's interesting about this is there's a lot of interesting lines of inquiry. The recovery issue that has been brought up several times, that's another question I think also interesting to be thoughtfully dealt with. The insurance issue, fantastic, absolutely essential. But we want to thank Professor Char Miller so much for spending his Sunday with us, and at least part of his Sunday. and he's the author of a new book by Oregon State University Press, Burn Scars. Go get it, guys.
Yes,
Anyway.
please.
Yes. But anyway, thank you again, and we'll look
Thank
forward
you all
to
so much.
We look forward to talking with you again soon, Char. You have a
I
very
look
good
forward
day.
to it, Jim.
Thank you
you
so
all.
much.
Bye.